We're in the information age, but facts are in short supply. Reject the noise, ask bold questions, and seek the truth with FBI whistleblower and common sense extremist, Steve Friend. This is the American Radicals Podcast.
It is the American Radicals Podcast. It's May 29th, 2026. Congratulations. It's a Friday. You made it through the grind, Monday to Friday. It's noontime if you happen to be catching us over on Rumble and YouTube. So you're like halfway to the end of the day, but close enough. And if you're a federal employee, it's a federal Friday, so you're probably in the car on the way to the house. We got our loaded down for a Friday today. We're going to talk about how opposing data centers might make you a terrorist, but also you could want to hire a man, which could make you a terrorist. Federal judges in the state of California really hate America, and we must beef up the post office's policing powers. So let's get after it. You know, there's a saying, if you throw a rock into a pack of dogs, the one that yelps is the one that you hit, because people sort of let you know where they're vulnerable. And that's really why, if you happen to be a regular of the American Radicals Podcast, if you're a regular consumer of the content, you will notice that I almost exclusively rely on leftist, communist media sources. Not because I get a real thrill of reading the communist rags that are out there, but they telegraph where they intend to go if you just have the gumption to read through it. If you have the ability to keep your eyes on the text rather than allowing them to roll out of your head because there's just so much wokeness and liberalism and things that are nonsensical, they telegraph exactly where they are. Now, that's also kind of a way that humans are in general. We like to be around like-minded people. There's a reason that cops tend to hang out with cops. They're security-minded. They're very cynical. They're always looking for threats out there, and they're just kind of roll their eyes, and everybody is just bebopping along like a regular sheep. You know, being sort of a security conscious person, I remember going to a hotel with my wife, and then she closed the door and she saw the evacuation plan on the back of the door, and she kind of chuckled and laughed. She goes, "Who looks at this? This is ridiculous." And I said, "I do, every single time I'm in a hotel, because that's just the way my mindset is." Same thing is people who work the overnight shift. If you work the night shift, you tend to hang out with people who work the night shift because they get it, right? I mean, again, back to the wife. I remember when I was working overnights as a cop, she would say, "Hey, you know, it'd be great. Why don't we go get dinner with some friends or with my parents, and then you can go to work?" And I used to say, "Why don't I wake you up at 2 o'clock in the morning and ask you to force feed down a steak dinner, hang out with my parents, and then you could go to work? I'm just not going to be that chipper of a mood." And she was like, "Well, no, it's completely different." And I said, "No, it's actually the exact same situation. You just have to flip the AM to the PM and the PM to the AM." But it didn't make sense to her. She didn't live that way. But that's why people who work the overnight shift get along together. That's also why married people tend to hang out with married people, or people with kids hang out with people with kids. Because if you're married and have kids, you don't have room in your life or an ability to connect to some single dude who's batching it out and going out on the weekends. There's just no sort of commonality there. There's no common thread. So the common thread that I look for when I read the leftist communist media sources to you on the AMRAD pod is to find out where they're telegraphing. Where they tell you that they're afraid is actually them telling you where they intend to go if and when they ever get power. So I want to begin today from a story from Wired magazine, which is of the hard left, but they're actually pretty spot on with a bunch of different national security things, and they come at it again from the leftist side of the perspective. But if there is an overlap with what we like to focus in on here, and if there is a view of government being weaponized, we will highlight it. So from Wired, U.S. law enforcement warns of anti-tech extremism as AI hatred grows. And this is a very long piece. I have the link in the show notes for today, guys. Definitely worth your time, but we will work our way through it quite a bit because there's a little bit of a history lesson here. There's a little bit of context that we can kind of color in if you happen to be new to the idea that, oh, perish the thought, your government might be trying to go after you as some kind of a terrorist because you're engaged in wrongthink. So the Donald Trump DOJ is targeting anyone holding anti-American, anti-Christian, and anti-capitalism beliefs. Again, from the left, they hate America, they hate Christianity, they hate all religions, and they hate capitalism. So they're feeling vulnerable, they're feeling scared, they're worried that they're within the crosshairs of an out-of-control weaponized government. They mentioned Seb Gorka, who said that left-wing extremists are a top threat, and the FBI surveilled activists as part of its broader investigation into, as it calls, anarchist, violent, extremist actors. No further information. So we're just kind of making up categories regardless of who was in charge. We've gone over the categories before. You had actual terrorists, but our military did a really good job of going overseas, of breaking things and killing people, hurting feelings, and there just weren't a whole bunch of terrorists there to come and attack the homeland. So what is the definition of success in a government bureaucracy with a zero-fail mission to defend the homeland against all enemies? You just have to start making them up. So we had domestic violent extremists. Well, they actually came after the homegrown violent extremists. I'm getting ahead of myself. Homegrown violent extremists, those were people who were new to America, maybe first generation, but they still had ideology that was inspired by foreign terrorist organizations abroad, maybe Boko Haram or Al Qaeda or ISIS. And they were generally retards who were entrapped into schemes. And then we ran out of them. So we transitioned then to the domestic violent extremists, which had all these different branches. And that included folks on the left. I mean, it could be like the BLM activists, the eco-terrorist types, or it could be the militia violent extremists, like the Wolverine Watchmen. Again, a bunch of low intelligence, vulnerable people who were entrapped by the government and accused of being terrorists and convinced to do their worst ideas, which they never would have carried out, were not capable or predisposed to even do. And then we had further mission creep. We had other sort of terminology. You had racially motivated violent extremists, which meant you were a Catholic who liked to go to the Latin Mass, and then the agave, anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists by the FBI and Department of Homeland Security's own telling is someone with a perception of government overreach or negligence or illegitimacy. Not and or, just or. A perception of government overreach, like being forced to take an experimental jab in your arm in order to have a job. But could that be construed as overreach? Do you think that? Well, then you're probably an agave. Do you think that opening the southern border was maybe a little bit negligent on behalf of the federal government? Again, strictly within the crosshairs of a counterterrorism investigation, a domestic terrorism investigation at the hands of the federal government. And now we've transitioned and introduced some new categories. We have the nihilistic violent extremist, which is problematic for a couple of reasons. One, because nihilists don't tend to have a belief structure, and normally you have to have an ideology when you're in this space. And then also, when you look at the definition, the FBI, I think, fits the bill as a nihilistic violent extremist group, which goes online and radicalizes young people into doing things that are disruptive to their own lives. Again, the FBI playbook fits the bill quite nicely. So we're introducing new terms here, and Wired Magazine goes into the new one. So we have the anarchist, violent extremist. No further information. I guess it's open for interpretation. But I think one of the most profound statements that they make in this piece is as follows. Taken together, these Trump administration directives, because they're from the left, but they come from the federal government, which is always a problem. They've commandeered the domestic surveillance apparatus to surveil and criminalize speech and assembly that challenges the ideology of the White House. Oh, you mean people who might be engaged in wrongthink, might be spreading out dis, or malinformation, information that could be correct, but it's just inconvenient for the ruling regime? I think that's the exact definition that we were laying out there a couple of years ago during the Joe Biden auto pen administration. But the problem is, if you're consistent, you'll have roughly half of the country on your side at one time and against you, and then it'll flip flop 180 degrees, photo negative the other when the power pendulum swings back and forth. But if you happen to have a modicum of integrity, you kind of stay over the target. If you have that North Star and say it's always wrong for the federal government to go after people for engaging in First Amendment protected speech or assembly, that is in fact a problem. So for right now, strange bedfellows, Wired magazine seems to kind of have their thumb or their eye on what is going on here. They get their finger in the wind, seeing where it's blowing. Now, we had the term of anarchist violent extremists, but here's the newest and latest and greatest: anti-tech violent extremism. I guess that's going to be ATVE. Now, there are fusion centers around the country, and they are looking into these ATVEs. Again, anti-technology violent extremists. No further information, completely up to the definition of the federal government. Fusion centers, there's like, I think 80 of them around the country as they are. I mean, they're just information gathering hubs that proliferate information as it comes in to various law enforcement entities so that they're abreast of actual threats that are out there or situations that might need their attention. So fusion centers are doing some stuff, but it is monitoring people for engaging in perfectly legal activity. So homegrown violent extremists or environmental extremists may target U.S. data centers. No further information, no credible information. It's just a warning. People who don't like how the data center could be pulling up a whole bunch of water out of the ground, they could be an eco-terrorist, right? We better keep an eye on that. Agaves, anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremists, they're engaged in pre-operational planning, targeting data centers and other critical infrastructure. No further information. Pre-operational. I mean, that sounds like conspiracy. Like maybe somebody within the group, perhaps, I mean, I'm going to go way out on the longest limb, perhaps somebody who's being paid by the federal government as a confidential human source has found himself a group of dudes who like to go shoot guns and hang out and drink beer over the weekend and said, I could characterize these guys as a bunch of agaves. Hey, maybe I should say, are you guys uber mad at your electricity bills from the data center that's coming into town? And now all of a sudden that shooting session looks like it's pre-operational planning sort of methodology. Now, the federal government is also relying on open source intelligence companies, not just open source information, OSINT, where analysts who work for the federal government go out and look over social media because it's all out in the public. They will just troll social media accounts and glom it all up, hoover up, and create their intelligence bulletins and reports and say that with low, medium, or high confidence in X, Y, or Z. No, actually, what the federal government now is doing is contracting with private organizations, private enterprises, and asking them to do it because they're more competent, they're more capable, and they can just hand it on over to the federal government. Sounds a lot like sedition hunters were during the January 6th sort of stuff. Fusion centers are monitoring demonstrations at local civic events like budget meetings for a county or a school board meeting where people have a First Amendment right to go and speak to the school board, but they're being monitored by counterterrorism resources within the federal government because they might be going to the school board or to the county budget meeting and saying, hey, I got a problem with this data center that's coming in here. Ooh, does that mean that you're an anti-tech violent extremist, which we haven't defined yet? Now, Wired magazine from the hard left is telegraphing where they're scared, ergo where they will use the mechanisms of power if and when the communist left gets back into power. And here's the key final piece before we move off of this. Domestic terrorism is not a standalone crime that is brought to bear during trial. That's true. This whole thing where we have domestic terrorist organizations officially declared under the Donald Trump Part 2 administration, that's brand new. That's not a thing. We actually have designated foreign terrorist organizations out of the State Department, but now we're going to declare domestic terrorist organizations, and again, without the force of law. You have to have the law on your side. So domestic terrorism is not a standalone crime. Instead, domestic terrorism laws allow for targeting and surveillance of extremists. No further information. Extremists being whoever the government says is an extremist, with charges sometimes bearing from terrorism enhancements, sometimes excluding them altogether. This has led to protesters and activists being surveilled under domestic extremism provisions while being charged with crimes like criminal trespass or vandalism. So we're going to enhance local crime if there is, in fact, even a crime. And on top of that, if there isn't a crime, we're still going to use federal resources to surveil and characterize people as extremists, ergo, the implication being that they're terrorists, justifying the use of national security resources in order to go after people. And then once you have your man, you can find a crime because they're engaging in wrongthink or ideas that the government deems to be problematic because the government has another agenda, because the government wants to push forward some sort of economic policy or environmental policy or a tax. It is. The government is interested in what the government wants to do. And if you want to stand and obstruct that, you might find yourself on the wrong side of a domestic terrorism investigation. And Wired is all over it for now. Now, when the communist left comes back into power, are they going to learn the lesson that Wired magazine is advocating for and saying domestic terrorism is being abused? That these investigations are not righteous? Or is it just them telegraphing exactly what is going to go on? Now, before we kind of go on to the problems that might be the outgrowth of this, of how it's going to be the opportunity when the pendulum swings to the other side, are you, in fact, going to be an anti-tech violent extremist if you hold the wrong beliefs? Well, I've got a couple of reports here, and let's see if we can analyze them. Washington Post, because democracy dies in darkness. This is an opinion piece, and this is advocated by a military veteran. Headline: blocking the construction of data centers is a national security risk. National security, as my good friend Garrett Boyle might say. Debates over data centers construction have generally targeted the issue of local zoning nuisance, threat to the environment, affordable electricity, but this overlooks a crucial fact. The rapid construction of data centers and advanced energy infrastructure required to power them are foundational to American military power and must be a national security priority. Now, many communities are understandably worried because there could be things like higher electricity costs, their water might get used and abused and made like really, really dirty. If you're an environmental sort, you worship the sun monster, you could be worried about carbon emissions, whatever it is. If you have some sort of a concern about a data center being built in your local area, you're now a threat to national security. Being advocated here in a Washington Post, leftist media, mainstream communist leftist media, and they're going to start the narrative here: national security. Well, if you're arguing in favor of, if you're arguing in opposition to the construction of something that is an imperative for national security, wouldn't that mean that you're against national security? Wouldn't that mean that you're a threat to national security? Are you being radicalized? Are you an extremist? I mean, what was the radicalizing event? You hear these stories about the homegrown violent extremist. You know, he was a kid, he was 16, and then he got racially profiled, and then he went online and started reading a bunch of ISIS stuff, and as a result of that, he became radicalized. I mean, the narrative sort of writes itself from the leftist media that we always were consuming and then rolling our eyes at, saying, no, he was a terrorist the entire time. Well, it ain't no fun when the rabbit's got the gun. How about a radicalizing event reported here in the Politico in relation to these data centers? Headline: a data center drained 30 million gallons of water unnoticed until residents complained about low water pressure. Now, this was in Georgia, I believe, Fayetteville, Georgia. So it was a pretty affluent subdivision named Adelise Park. Annalise Park. So the county utility investigated how water pressure was going down, and they realized that there was two industrial scale water hookups feeding the data center that was 20 miles south of their area, and they'd never actually been registered. One had been online, but they just hadn't been billing the utilities to the data center. And the other one was just kind of a mystery. That was a giant hookup that was sucking the water out of the area. So this subdivision, when you went to take a shower, it was just trickling out of the faucet. So all told, this data center, which is called Quality Technology Services, they owed about $150,000 in unpaid water bills. Now, they made good, they paid back, they said, oh, our bad, no penalties, no fines, no interest on the back payments. If you didn't pay your utility bill, I think there might be some fines there, even if it was the fault of the utility company, they'd still charge you. Doesn't that get you a little bit angry? But I mean, how about a local? How about an individual who actually puts his name on it? This is a guy who's running for office. He said, we get this notification from Fayette County Water System saying you need to stop watering your lawns to help conserve water, says James Clifton. He's an attorney running for, I think, state office. So the first thing they do is lean on the individuals and the citizens to stop water consumption when we have a data center that's just absolutely draining us. Most months, it's the number one consumer of water in the county. Statistically true. You just have to look at the consumption factors. But he's there arguing against the almighty data center. Doesn't that make him an anti-tech violent extremist? In fact, one who's trying to attain government office? Well, he needs to be obstructed. He could be a problem. Now, Wired Magazine has highlighted that. They're saying that now we've set the framework. We have the precedent in place where you have an out-of-control government that has an agenda here. In this case, they want to build as many data centers as they possibly can, and anybody who stands in the way of that can not just be an individual who says, hey, look, I have an ideological preference for something alternative to what the government is doing, and I'm peacefully expressing that, using my First Amendment rights in order to do that in whatever setting I want to do. If I want to stand on a street corner holding a sign, I will. If I want to go down to the school board, I will. If I want to picket outside the county board of commissioners, I will. But now it's within the purview of the federal government to get involved and say, no, in fact, you doing that is something that we're going to surveil you for and characterize it as being anti-tech violent extremism. And then we'll have our man, and then we'll find a crime. And because you're doing the otherwise lawful activities like speaking freely, we may or may not get a terrorism enhancement on that. This is the problem. This is the problem. Wired Magazine's identifying it now, but in years gone by, it was the bright parts of the world. Wherever it was, it's always the problem. And, outside of the tech thing, I want to go back to a story we covered down on a day or two ago. I can't remember. It all kind of blends together, guys, this week, just trying to find the information that's out there and bring it to you on the AMRAD pod. I want to go back to this NPR piece, which was about far-right extremism. Again, pack of dogs, you throw the rock, the one that yelps is the one that you hit. So the one that is the subject that is yelping right now from the NPRs of the hard communist left is about far right extremism, white supremacy, anti-woman. Let's set the precedent. Let's set the narrative so that when the pendulum swings, their concerns can go to their offensive mechanisms. Their worries right now are going to be the charges that they bring down the road. Now, we did a long and deeper dive on this one, but I did want to go back into it because I failed to mention this, which I think is important. So one of the cat ladies that they were looking to as an expert, her name was Heidi Byrick, and so she and some other extremism experts say the attack at this Islamic center in San Diego is a clear warning signal that the long-standing problem of white supremacist terrorism has not gone away. They're going to go back to the J6 stuff. They're going to go back to the agave, anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremists. They're going to go back to Joe Biden giving his red speech saying that Americans are the problem. White supremacy is on the rise. You are the threat to the country. And so it has rekindled concern that the Trump administration's pivot away from countering violent far-right extremism domestically and abroad. The argument being made here is that white supremacy is still the greatest overall outstanding threat to the country. So they're going to go right back to it. And the Donald Trump administration, part due, is getting us off focus, getting us off mission. The left is ready. They are absolutely prepared to dust this thing off, bring it right back with a vengeance. And they keep alluding to this U.S. counterterrorism strategy. And I have a link to it. Again, I'll put it in the show notes. This is what it looks like. And it's the ring of power, guys. It's anybody who's engaged in wrongthink, opposition to what the administration is arguing here. So in this counterterrorism strategy, they're quick to point out how Joe Biden's name is mentioned 7 times throughout the document. Oh my goodness. How many times did they say that Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans were a threat to our sainted democracy? Pot calling kettle, but it's still a problem if you're putting your political rival into a counterterrorism strategy. So in addition to omission of far-right terrorism, the document mentions violent secular political groups, radically pro-transgender, and I guess they say that they name the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a problem for NPR. But again, we're back to the concern over white supremacy. And then something else they mentioned here is that cultural Marxism, the term where we're trying to bring about Marxism, socialism, communism via the schools, via the culture, through advertising, entertainment, all these mechanisms in which to bring it in. That's a conspiracy theory that is attached to white supremacy and anti-feminism. And that's the overall message here. And they're saying, well, they're also anti-gay. They're opposed to the LGBTQAI plus hashtag underscore tilde rainbow kamikaze. So all of the blender is still there. We're going to throw it in there, but they throw out how the true threat to America is not, in fact, what we're being told by the Donald Trump Part 2 administration and their counterterrorism strategy, because they're too focused on things like the Muslim Brotherhood and Joe Biden and Antifa. In fact, according to the communist left, it's the far right, white supremacy, anti-woman. So they're fearful now. They're telegraphing where they're going to take it when they get into power. And we said that you could be construed as being a terrorist if you have a problem with your water pressure and you don't like the data center being built. What if you are a hiring manager at a private firm and you're being obligated to do things that are against your morality, against the law, because you're being told you're not allowed to hire men, and you throw the flag, raise your hand, say, hey, look, I don't think that's legal. I don't think that's within our policy. Well, doesn't that make you anti-woman? Could that make you an extremist? Could that make you a far-right white supremacist? Well, it's going to have a hard time making that case if you, in fact, are a hiring manager at one of these companies, because this new study just came out. 1 in 6 hiring managers have been told to stop hiring white men. I guess if you point it out, that would make you part of the problem in the eyes of the Marxist, communist, leftists who aspire to obtain power and use it, because that's what communists do, reward their friends and punish their enemies. A couple of takeaways, though, from this poll, which are unbelievable. There were 1,000 hiring managers who were polled for this. Half believe their companies practice reverse discrimination, which, if I'm going to be pedantic and a jerk, it's not a thing. You either discriminate or you don't. But what it essentially means is you have policies in place to assist or give a hand up or an unfair advantage to racial minorities or women. And in fact, what winds up happening is it's a cudgel, and you're, instead of lifting some up, you're pushing others down, the others being white men. Half believe that their companies are doing that. 1 in 6 have been asked to deprioritize hiring men. Half have been asked to prioritize diversity over qualification. Half believe their job will be in danger if they don't hire enough diverse employees. So they're just good Germans, just going along with the hiring policies of any particular company, which are diametrically opposed to employment law in this country. But if they raise that concern, and then you get a President American Psycho in office, who's at the helm controlling the national security operations, the apparatus, and says, "Hey, threat to national security. I'm leaning on my experts on extremism over from the NPRs, which I'm now funding because I'm President American Psycho Gavin Newsom." You know, you know, I think that those hiring managers are actually extremists. I think that they can be construed as white supremacists. We should probably investigate them, and if they remain in any position within these companies, those companies could be providing material support to a terrorist ideology, even if it's a domestic terrorist ideology, because now the Trump administration has squeezed the toothpaste out of the tube and the genie is out of the bottle and says that domestic terrorism is an actual thing and we can declare organizations. Now, the cultural Marxism stuff, I want to dig into that a little bit. Said it's basically a way of bringing in an economic system, a governing system through entertainment and education and athletics and amusement, all these different things. Chief among them is education. All these ideas originate at the university. Now, let's go to Washington Post and talk about how cultural Marxism is experiencing a pushback, but how quickly will that snap back if and when the pendulum in politics swings to the left? A headline from the Washington Post, because democracy dies in darkness, how one university is purging and replacing woke classes. Woke in nice quotation marks, because Washington Post doesn't believe that woke is a thing. Now, what they do is compare and contrast at the outset two classes at the University of Florida, Gainesville, Florida, my home state, the land of milk and honey, where woke, weaponization, and winter go to die. One class is Intro to Sociology, which is a class for professionally useless people. And then there's also a class on early America. It's a history class. So the history class is in a department that's on the rise. It's actually getting millions of dollars in funding, while the Intro to Sociology, beginning this fall, the class covers issues like inequality, race, gender, all those buzzwords that the communist Marxists love to use. It's no longer going to count for general education requirements, and they're expecting the enrollment in that to plummet. So the argument the Washington Post makes is that the sociology class is being strangled and the history class is being allowed to thrive. Now, the history class, which is part of this department, it's getting millions of dollars and it's being advocated, is because the Florida, the 2023 passed a law. They're going to go after the wokeness in universities, in publicly funded universities. So actually, Florida law bars schools from giving general education credits to classes that identify that use identity politics, saying like immutable characteristics, like the color of your skin or what you got dangling between your legs. Like, that's really important. If you do that in the class, we're not going to give you credit towards graduation at a state university anymore. You can't have theories that are systemic racism and sexism and oppression, all the things that NPR and the people that they quote and cite all the time that they believe as dyed-in-the-wool communists are absolutely true. If you teach that in classes in state universities within the state of Florida, you can't get college credit for it. So the University of Florida actually went back. I think they reviewed all of their curriculum. I think it's 1,200 classes, and they had to remove 500 of them. Almost half of the classes at the flagship university for the land of milk and honey were teaching identity politics and woke crap. They had to be eliminated. So Florida is now in compliance with the state law. And they also want to promote and preserve a constitutional republic. Oh my goodness. You mean what our actual system of government is? The Washington Post is very upset by this. Other university professors are extremely upset by this. They're saying that they need to have more diversity of opinion at the university campus, which is always funny to me because the word university, let's just be pedantic for a minute. University, it means one truth. So wouldn't diversity be the exact opposite of that? If the pursuit of the university is one truth, wouldn't including diversity, which would mean a departure from truth because there can't be more than one truth, there just is the truth, wouldn't diversity be the opposite? It would be heretical to what the university's stated purpose is? All right, pedantic moment is over. The last thing from this Washington Post piece, again, it's all about how one university is changing and purging and replacing woke classes. As civic centers surge and so-called woke classes are purged, critics say universities are being pulled backwards to a time when society mandated that views of white European men be valued above all others. So you could see, if we're going to be consistent with the pack of dogs analogy, Washington Post is a screaming about this. Because when the leftists get into power again, the University of Florida is going to be squarely within the crosshairs. They're an institution that now, in the eyes of the left, is advocating for white supremacy because they're teaching actual history, that the American continent was largely founded by European men who traversed the ocean, that our system of government was inspired by a bunch of white dudes who read about the Greeks and the Romans, and they tried to combine all that into some pesky, dusty documents. And because we don't do the 1619 project like the leftists want, and instead we're actually focused on true American history, scars and all, that is going to be construed as advocating on behalf of white supremacist ideology, being opposed to diversity, extremist in nature, and probably something that is going to lead to violence, ergo needs to be investigated by a robust and muscular federal government law enforcement apparatus. They're screaming dogs. They are yelping exactly where they're going to go. The telegraph is in. So we're going to stay on this. But before we do, guys, I do want to take a moment and remind you all, if you haven't, please do give us a nice thumbs up, the likes, shares, the subscribes, the comments, everything. We appreciate it on YouTube and Rumble at AmRadPod. And if you wouldn't mind, if you haven't already this week, and if you have, just do it again. Go to the American Radicals podcast over at Spotify. You can follow us there as well and give us a nice play. The link there will be in the show notes, as it always is. I think it's always the first link. I try to do that. And I will try to run the ad for right about now. And we can get back to what we want to cover down on this Friday edition. And I want to take a step back again and dig into a little bit of this anti-weaponization fund. So we're going to go back over that like we did with the hatred of the women being the all things evil within terrorism in the views of NPR. Now, we talked about this anti-weaponization fund, the 1776. I like to think of it as like the We the People fund, because everything within the Trump administration is all about PR and marketing. But as a reminder, the Justice Department is attempting to stand up a $1.776 billion fund. It's calling for anti-weaponization, and it is the result of a settlement agreement. So Donald Trump and a couple of his kids sued the Trump Treasury and IRS. So he sued his own department for $10 billion. And the settlement was reached. They said, look, we don't want any money. We want an apology, and we want this anti-weaponization fund stood up, which we can't collect out of, that is going to be there and available for people to apply who are victims of weaponization. And immediately media has snapped to and said, it's all about January 6th. It's not. January 6th isn't actually mentioned there. It's available to everybody except the Trump family. But any opportunity that they have, because they're a pack of dogs and you throw a rock and you hit them, they want to scream January 6th, white supremacy, over and over and over again. And there's been quite a bit of pushback, including from a bunch of Republicans who are gutless and using this anti-weaponization fund as a reason to not fund border security, because the Republicans are not conservative and they don't care about border security. They just want to appease their lobbyists and campaign donors and fundraisers who want cheap labor and indentured servitude and want to price out a bunch of Americans from jobs. So they're happy to just use whatever, any port in a storm, mind you, in order to stop border security, funding it. But back to the pushback that we're getting. So a new category has come in. It's not just the police officers who were at January 6th, the Harry Dunns who are, again, lining their own pockets. It's not just the weak Republicans in the Senate and the House. It's not the Democrats who are in the House Judiciary who are filing a lawsuit. They're getting a task force together. It's now a bunch of ex-judges. This comes from CBS News. Headline reads, dozens of ex-judges push to look into Trump's anti-weaponization fund settlement, calling it a fraud on the court. Now, they want this case reopened, these judges. They're saying that the settlement would allow, they want it reopened because the court has to commence an inquiry into whether the court was deceived, including with respect to the existence of an underlying case or controversy, blah, blah, blah. It's a bunch of legal eagle nerds who are saying things. The key part, retired judges wrote that the settlement deal is a product of collusion and is itself a fraud on the court. Collusion. I think they're a bunch of yelping dogs. How do I know? Because every single time there's a Democrat communist in charge, the EPA goes to the courts and settles every lawsuit. There'll be some eco group that worships Gaia and the sun monster and says that SUVs and cow farts are causing the ozone layer to have a hole and a bunch of acid rain. And we have global warming and it's an existential threat. That means that Al Gore has to put out another movie and make $1 billion for himself. It's some group like that, right? And then they sue the EPA, which is populated at its executive levels and throughout the ranks as well, but heavily in the executive levels under a Democrat administration with fellow travelers, intellectual fellow travelers. So what happens? The EPA goes to court and immediately settles and says, oh, our hands are tied. We had a settlement here. I guess we're just going to have to shell out a bunch of money to whatever causes that this group wanted. Meanwhile, we are just pillaging the American people's treasury to take that money from the money that was stolen, I mean taxed, in order to prop up some NGOs and nonprofits and whatever cause celeb that the left wants. Yelping dogs, they're screaming about exactly what they want to do and take it out of like an EPA context. And that's just the one that came to top of mind. All these other groups do the same thing. How about individuals? How about how I was told after having been fake rehired by the FBI for 6 days, and then in preparation for firing me, leaking that they intended to fire me to media, which is against privacy laws and employment laws, that I could sue, but I would lose because they held all the power, and it would take years and 6 figures of litigation in order to fund the litigation. I would have to pay $100,000 in order to have the privilege of losing to the federal government. Meanwhile, people like Lisa Page and Peter Strzok and Andy McCabe get $1 million each because immediately the government settles. It's almost as if the DOJ colluded with Lisa Page and Peter Strzok and Andy McCabe, because that's exactly what went on there. They were good and faithful servants. They were what the communists considered to be friends, and therefore the communists are obligated to reward them for their service. This collusion goes on all the time. The judges here are just screaming about it because they're communists, and they see the collusion happening if there in fact is something there, because a deal was struck between Donald Trump and his own Treasury Department. I imagine there was a little bit there, but it offends the sensibilities now, very much like it offends the sensibilities of the leftists who write over her Wired magazine about how First Amendment speech might be being infringed upon when the Republicans are in charge of the White House. But if Joe Biden is there, those people are just against democracy, who are out there standing outside of a government building that's open 24 hours a day and redressing their grievances in front of Congress, asking them to pause the certification of an election in which one white dude was leading over the other white dude. And then we all went to bed and we woke up, and the second place dude had somehow acquired millions of more votes with no accountability. And that made those people who were protesting that white supremacists somehow. Consistency is really not within the purview of a communist in this country, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong right now. Now, in regard, again, to this anti-weaponization fund and the screaming that is going on, the wailing and gnashing of teeth, they're also, from the communist left, going to telegraph how much they hate the American people and what they intend to do about it. Joe Biden, the auto pen, the human Roomba, stood up there, gave his speech just before the midterms of 2022, and he essentially told you, I hate you I want bad things for you, violence against you, and I'm willing to use the military, as evidenced by the 2 Marines standing in dress blues behind me that are backlit. I'm willing to use every apparatus at my fingertips in order to punish my political enemies. Because Joe Biden, as much as he had pudding for brains, is still a dyed-in-the-wool communist. But how about somebody who doesn't have pudding for brains? Somebody who is likely to become the president of the United States. Oh my gosh, I have to say it. President American Psycho, Gavin Newsom, who is hashtag resisting the anti-weaponization funds, coming from the Politico headline, Newsom vows 100% tax on DOJ anti-weaponization fund payouts. Quote, anyone from California that receives any of those funds, we want to tax 100% of those proceeds. He says it's a slush fund, and his pledge mirrors legislation that was just unveiled in New York by this Democrat communist whose name is Alex Borez, state assembly member, and he's also running for the House. And New York wants to as well assess a 100% tax from anybody. Now, are they going to specify if your weaponization claim is related to January 6th or not? I don't think they're going to, which would be interesting. I mean, let's say that, I don't know, James Comey sues and somehow wins. Better one, Letitia James. She lives in New York. Do you think she's going to be taxed at 100%? Well, the law is the law and nobody's above the law. Isn't that exactly what we heard? We don't just target individuals. It should be equal. We don't have a two-tiered system of justice. This entire thing will have to be fleshed out. But what I want to highlight is they are telegraphing in California and New York, high-ranking officials, elected officials, the governor, the chief executive of California, and somebody who aspires to federal office in New York and was able to actually get this onto the docket, how much they hate people who they perceive to be their political enemies, which again lends me back to my proposal that I think is probably the suboptimal yet only thing that I can think of. We're going to have an amicable divorce in the very near future to avoid a kinetic action in this country. To avoid us devolving into Antietam Part 2, we're probably going to hash this thing out in a mediation and say, hey, look, we can't go to couples counseling because you want to cut the healthy breast tissue or the twig and berries off my child and tell Harry that he become a Sally. And that's not a reconcilable difference. So we should probably just part our ways. And in the meantime, if you're going to tax 100% of people that agree with the way I view the world, then we'll use the mechanisms of power in the other direction and say like, hey, California, you get no federal resources then. I mean, I guess the federal resources that you're effectively going to use as a flow through are going to be the 1776 anti-weaponization funds. Good luck with that. Enjoy that, because you don't get any sort of disbursements from the federal government. That includes VA benefits, Social Security benefits for any of your residents, no road upkeep, no federal law enforcement. Our court system is completely abandoned. You all can have a sanctuary state because, you know, what we're going to do, we're going to step up and stand around the border of California, a whole bunch of ICE dudes. But within that, unless they try to exit, you can choke on it. I think ultimately that's going to be the thing we have to do to give ultimate limited government a chance in many of these communist enclaves and see how much they like it. But for what we're talking about today, if you do have a president American psycho and he wants to enforce something like a 100% tax on people who he deems to be his political enemies, how could that be policed? I mean, you have to stand up a robust policing mechanism, not just an FBI. You to have all hands on deck. This is white supremacy, after all. Those people who went to the Capitol that day, even though they voted for one white guy over another, they're white supremacists. They probably hate women. So how would you go after them? Well, I guess you would mobilize your post office. So Washington Post has a interesting, we'll say, piece about this one. It's an opinion, and it comes from a guy who used to be or is in some way affiliated with postal policing, which is a thing because our government's way too big. Headline, it's time to address America's mail theft epidemic. It's an epidemic, guys. I guess it's not a pandemic yet, but it's getting there. So over the past 2 decades, the U.S. Postal Service has steadily dismantled its uniformed police force. The agency employed 450 police officers last year. It was 1,400 in 2000. So, last quarter century, they've dropped about 1,000 of their uniformed police officers. In 2020, the agency went further, depolicing itself with a directive that limited officers to protecting Postal Service property. They essentially made them like the Secret Service police. They're doing hardened security outside the facilities, making sure there's no trespassing and damage or anything like that. But what's being advocated here in the Washington Post is they want to have proactive street level patrols designed to stop mail theft. They want to send a bunch of post office cops in black and whites patrolling neighborhoods. That's what the advocacy is, because mail theft is on the rise statistically. It's a surge in mail crime. So this is an unsurprising result of the Postal Service's shift from prevention to reaction. Prevention. You like pre-crime? Pre-crime, where it's only possible in science fiction novels and film. If you're one of the precogs, right? In Minority Report, those three guys that were in the milk that could somehow see into the future and say that Tom Cruise was going to murder somebody, and the entire movie is based about how that's not even possible in science fiction. The advocacy here is, yeah, we need to arm up, staff up, beef up the post office with police, with arrest powers, with the ability to inflict force and potentially death on those, to go out and proactively do pre-crime and not just react to packages that might be seized off somebody's porch. Or maybe we just completely shutter the entire thing. We don't need a post office. We have FedEx. We have UPS. I couldn't tell you the price of a stamp because I don't use the Postal Service. Neither does just about anybody I know, because I hang around people who are intellectual fellow travelers as me, as I advocated in the beginning, people that worked overnight shifts I got along with when I worked overnight shifts, people who are security conscious because I'm security conscious. I think that most people in the AMRAD pod audience could probably get on board with, we don't need a post office anymore. And they're screaming and hollering because they want this ability, this capability, this enhancement, so that it's at their fingertips for a future time when it's pretty convenient for them. Okay, so I've got two more that I want to get to as I close this out. I know we're going a little bit longer today, guys, but it's a Friday, and I want to make sure that I cover down and have a clean slate for next week. So I saw this, and this is reporting from ABC News about the Supreme Court, and it's dealing with Florida and California, two diametrically opposed views. People from one definitely don't hang out with people from another, which is why intellectual fellow travelers are fleeing from California to Florida. Headline, Supreme Court rejects Florida's bid to sue states over truck licenses for immigrants. It means illegal aliens, but it's ABC News, and they're a communist leftist news outlet. Now, this is all stemming from this tractor trailer driver who made the illegal U-turn in Florida and decapitated a whole bunch of people, killed them. DRT, dead right there. And Florida brought a lawsuit against California and Washington State and said, hey, you're giving CDLs, commercial driver's licenses, to people who don't speak English and are illegal aliens. And we're suing you because it's a danger. And the Supreme Court said, no, sorry about that. We can't weigh in on that. So we don't have a mechanism. How does that function? How do we have a constitutional republic like they're trying to teach at the University of Florida right now if we don't have the ability for one state to have a feud with another and have it properly adjudicated? Now, on top of that, on top of the Supreme Court just completely punting, I believe Alito and Thomas were the only two that said, yeah, it's probably a good idea for us to adjudicate it. You know, the stalwarts of conservatism, It's particularly like the three Trump appointees all punted on that one. Shocker. But separately from the Supreme Court, there's a federal appeals court. They blocked the Trump administration proposal to impose new restrictions that would limit what California and Washington are going to do. So you don't have a executive at a federal level who can actually stop this from going on. You don't have states who can do it. We're just going to allow it to happen. We're going to allow states to flood our roadways with illegal aliens and the ability to operate extremely large, extremely complex, and extremely dangerous vehicles that are killing American citizens because the courts just can't be bothered. All right, one more that I want to get into, and we've done the hating women is terrorism one, and we did the 1776 We the People Fund. I have one more callback that I want to get to just to close us out, and this relates to this whole NDA for federal employees that we touched on earlier this week, because the Trump administration is pushing government-wide for a non-disclosure agreement for all federal employees. Dug a little bit more into it, got a little bit more details, and I think it's worth just kind of laying them out there for you because, again, the yelping dogs, when the communists come to power, you can't tell me that they're not going to use these mechanisms, and that is exactly what is being laid out for them right now. So this non-disclosure agreement, the proposal, it's just proposed at this point. It's not letter of the law. It's not any sort of regulation yet. It includes a provision stating that confidential information should only be used for performing your official duties. Employees who sign the non-disclosure agreement would also agree to promptly notify their agency if any unauthorized disclosures they suspect or become aware of. So they want you to inform on your neighbor, on your fellow employee, not just, I'm sure, for leaks to the press, but for bringing any information outside the organization. The non-disclosure agreements would remain in place even after federal employees change jobs or employers. So even if you leave federal service, you're still under an NDA. And let's say you want to say, I've retired. Let me tell you about the good old days back in the day when I was a FBI agent chasing down bad guys. So it doesn't have to deal with anything classified. I'm just telling you some of my war stories. You could be under an NDA. You could violate that by just using your First Amendment to tell about stories about cool things that you saw that are not classified at all, not top secret, not related to national security. Violations of the non-disclosure agreements could result in disciplinary action, could result in terminations, or civil or criminal penalties. Civil being you have to pay a bunch of money. Criminal could be incarceration, depends how far it goes. Now, let's digest this and lay out some of the concerns. Informing on others. That means you have a duty, very much like an insider threat, to report somebody taking information outside the organization, even if they took it through the proper channels, making a protected whistleblower disclosure. Then you have a polygraph possibility. You could be called in to do a polygraph if you have a security clearance. You're telling me that there's an NDA. In fact, they can ask you, have you violated the NDA? No. Have you taken information outside the organization? Yes. Oh, so you made protected whistleblower disclosures, that means. And now they're able to find you when you're supposed to have the capability of being anonymous. Opening up criminal cases. If there's a suspicion, say an allegation, one of your coworkers makes an allegation. Let's say that they really don't like you because they know you're whistleblowing. And then they just ask one of your good German colleagues to come forward and make an allegation, like my good buddy Garrett O'Boyle had to deal with, even though it was nonsensical. It was somebody who he'd never worked with, made an allegation. Just the mere existence of an allegation necessitated an investigation. Now you have a criminal mechanism. Well, we have an allegation, therefore we have a duty to investigate a violation of the law. Ergo, we're going to subpoena and do search warrants on your private communications and find out exactly who you're talking to. We have our man. Let's find a crime. And if we can't find a crime, we'll destroy their lives, destroy their professional prospects, make some sort of insinuations, leak it to the media, or build out a network of communications for other people that we can look at. And then ultimately, if somebody exercises their First Amendment rights, they could be within the crosshairs of a government criminal investigation. Last one, whistleblower designation. That's not a thing, by the way. How come every single time a guy like James Erdman or my buddy Garrett O'Boyle or George Hill or Kyle Seraphin or Marcus Allen, they come out, the communist left, the yelping dogs that they are getting hit with rocks, scream, well, they're not a designated whistleblower. That's not a thing. You just have to bring forward a reasonable concern of waste, fraud, abuse, risks to the public safety, violation of rule, policy, procedure, law, constitution. I've said it a bunch of times, so I can kind of recite it like Mike Johnson says, the principles of the Republican Party. That's designated whistleblower isn't an actual thing. You bring forward the concern, you go to the right channels. That could be Congress, could be Inspector General, could be somebody within your chain of command. You fit the statute. But the way that's going to go here is they're going to say, well, you weren't designated to make those whistleblower disclosures. Ergo, even though you followed the law, you fell afoul of this NDA policy. So we're going to pursue some sort of civil or criminal action against you. Or at the very least, we're just going to fire you because this is in the registry right now. This is in the federal code. We're entitled to do it. They're screaming, guys. They're a pack of yelping dogs, and every single time, be it a Republican in charge or a Democrat in charge, every single time they scream about things, they're telegraphing exactly where they intend to go. They're saying they're afraid right now. We're afraid of leaks right now. We're afraid they're going to come after us because of our First Amendment. They're going to go after those exact same things every single time that they get power. You just got to have the gumption to keep your eyes from rolling out of the sockets at the wokeism when you read it, which is what we endeavor to do every single time here. I know that I bring you these news sources. I know that there's things that you hate about the Washington Post because democracy dies in darkness, the New York Times, at one point a newspaper, NPR, still on the federal dole somehow. All of these different sources, they're vitally important to review so that you can figure out where they intend to go over the horizon. It's there to see if you have the gumption to see it. All right. So we've reached the end of the program today, guys, but I won't leave you without a palate cleanse for today and to send you off on a nice weekend. You know, the NPR was really all about how men hate women and that makes them terrorists. But I'm all about this palate cleanse, which says that women might take a bunch of years to trust each other and say, yeah, I don't really trust you, even though it's been a couple of years. But men, 5 minutes later, they're willing to do this for their buddy. Loyal? Yeah, maybe. Smart? Probably not. I don't know. Let you be the judge. All right, guys. Thank you again for joining us today and for this whole week. We'll plan to be back with you next week, Monday, noontime. And until then, have a great weekend.
You've been listening to the American Radicals Podcast. Find us on YouTube, Rumble, and X at AmRadPod.